Chapter 19. As the three of them arrived and pulled up the car directly behind the one that had been stolen and returned, Ash looked out through the gap in between the front seats. He'd volunteered to sit in the back, likened it to being a kid. He could see another car pulling up and parking in front of the car in question. Someone got out of the car that all three of them recognized. It was the head of forensics. He opened his boot, hidden from view for a few seconds, before reappearing with a briefcase in his left hand. The right hand already had a latex glove on. Then he swapped the case to his other hand and placed a glove on the left. He was ready to do business. "Hi, Iain," Gary said, remembering the man from previous investigations. Augustine and Ash remembered him from previous investigations too, and were already heading in the opposite direction. "Detective Hole, how are you?" Iain Mallon, the head of forensics, asked. Good. You?" Gary replied, starting to realize why the other two had disappeared. Iain Mallon had a reputation for taking a brief encounter and turning it into an hour-long conversation, and none of that hour was interesting. "Yes, I am very good. Looking forward to using these beauties on this car," Mallon said, tapping his briefcase knowingly. Gary didn't want to know what was inside, but he knew that if he hung around any longer, he'd find out. "Got to go, and need to catch the other two up. Same case as you and that car. We'll be back soon for an update," Gary said, walking away, trying to drown out the words from Iain Mallon as he broke into a jog. "Enjoy that," Ash smirked as Gary caught the other two up. "It's only a delay. He'll be there, waiting to give us an update when we get back," Gary responded, trying to fight fire with fire. "We'll let you deal with that," Ash pushed back. "You're obviously well acquainted." "This is the property," Augustine said, walking around to the rear of the place that reported the car missing. He wanted to step away from the petty squabbles and get down to business. The stern voice told the other two that he meant business. "And why are we round the back?" Gary asked. "Well, these places have access front and back. The fact that the person who took the car also brought it back meant that they knew most of the habitable rooms are at the back of the house. I've been in one of these before, and I know that the front contains the hall, bathroom, and a small bedroom. Everything else is at the back of the house: kitchen, living room, and main bedrooms. You're unlikely to disturb someone if you approach from the front." "And that means?" Gary asked, looking to be led rather than to lead. "It means that the person who took the car most probably knew the layout of these properties. If all he wanted was a car for a day or two, then he had the choice of any street or any car park in the whole of Washington, or even the surrounding areas. So, why did he choose here? The fact he knew his chances of success were high." "So, he lives here?" Ash asked. "Or he used to, but the fact that the car was returned to this address steers me to the first conclusion," Augustine replied, starting to walk along the back of the other houses on the row. As they reached the end property, Augustine spotted a trail of 2 muddy footmarks across the grass verge and onto the pavement. They led a route to the front door of the property. The freshness of the mud suggested that these had been left there in the previous few hours. "Let's knock on a few doors. Shall we start with this one?" Augustine asked, as the other two followed his lead. Gary pressed ahead of the other two and rapped his knuckles on the door. Just as he did that, something was thrown out of the window from directly above the front door, landing in the front garden. "Firework!" Ash shouted, and the three of them took shelter behind a bush, hoping that the offending fireworks shot off in the opposite direction. No such luck, as the banger whizzed toward the trio of detectives, dissecting them as 2 diving one way and 1 diving the other. As the noise reverberated against the hard plastic frame under the window, the 3 of them covered their ears. Looking up, Augustine saw movement across the back of the property. "This way," he said, giving chase and assuming that the other 2 would follow. Ash was soon on his feet, following. Gary had taken a blow to the leg from the firework and was busy pulling his trouser leg up to assess the damage, and put out the smouldering starts of a fire around the knee of his trousers. Ash had soon caught up and overtaken Augustine, stealing his stare on the back of the head of the man who had left the property at some speed. Ash wasn't able to make up any ground on the fleer, but he wasn't getting further away at the same time. The man looked over his shoulder and decided to change tactics from a straight foot race. He had the speed, but wasn't sure he had the stamina. The bushes that ran along the edge of Solgrave hid a pathway, and beyond that a series of fields. Ash followed the man on the track, losing his footing on the soft gravel that had been loosened by the rain the previous day. As he regained composure, Ash looked right, expecting the man to have travelled in that direction, still moving away from the door they had knocked on. But the man had doubled back, and was now running along the track in the direction he'd come from along the adjoining road. The irony of the fact that the man was probably on a couple of feet from Augustine forced Ash to grimace. There was nothing he could do about it. Ash gave chase again. By this time, the gap had tripled to what it was when he gave chase on the street. But Ash couldn't get any traction on the gravel track in his work shoes. He tried to keep an even pace without toppling over. The man almost disappeared into the distance as Ash and Augustine stayed on the track chasing behind. At the next gap between the road and the track, Ash returned to the steadier surface, hearing the small stones fall out of the grooves in his shoes and on to the hard surface. Augustine stayed on the track, his stamina coming into play. When he was young, Augustine ran cross-country in the winter, athletics in the summer. He was a middle-distance and long-distance runner, not much in the way of speed, but felt in those days like he could keep running all day. Not quite having the same feeling of perpetual motion, Augustine still knew where his strengths lay. Slow and steady might not always win the race, but it would put him in a position where he had a chance. And that's all he needed with this guy, to still be standing when the runaway had run out of energy and stopped. Every now and again, Augustine could see Ash through the bushes, a few paces ahead, but not much more than that. The man who had fled the property was still in his view, but extending his lead. Augustine opened up his stride, hoping to keep the man in sight for as long as possible. On one side was a maze of houses, the other a network of fields. As soon as he was out of sight, he could disappear to one of 100 different places. Ash was breathing heavily. Augustine could hear that. Their days of talking about sport were more frequent than their days of playing sport. At that point in time, Augustine resolved to go for more runs, play more squash, and get off his backside more often. It was always the same when he was chasing after someone. He made all the right resolutions. Just once he stopped running, all of that resolve dissipated into nothing but guilt. The man leaving the scene upped his pace. The two detectives were starting to get left behind. Ash had nothing left in the tank to increase his speed. Augustine didn't have much in the way of speed to begin with. As they reached the end of the alleyway, they had three choices: straight ahead to a housing estate, left to another, or right to the fields. Looking across, there was no movement in the fields. "He has to be back there," Ash said, pointing towards Solgrave through heavy breaths. "Fuck it," Augustine replied, not wanting to go into the rabbit warren chasing after a man who could be anywhere, inside or outside the maze of properties, alleys and garages. They headed off in the direction Ash pointed, looking left and right as they went for any signs that the man they were looking for was close. After a few seconds, Augustine heard a voice in the distance. "Detectives!" He pricked his ears up, trying to locate the direction of the voice. It went again. "Detectives!" Then there was a shout from another location, maybe a different voice this time. "Detectives!" Ash looked at Augustine for guidance. He had none. They listened as 20 voices from different parts of the estate joined in. Ash felt like he was at a strange football match, where the chant was only sung by one person at a time. They walked along through the estate towards the house where they last saw Gary and the car they left behind. As they walked, the echoes of the word repeated through the neighborhood like an early warning system. Augustine pictured people hiding their criminal deeds across the estate as they heard someone call that detectives were present. There was no chance they would find that man with all the commotion going on. People were starting to walk out of their properties, staring at the two detectives walking their way back through. As they walked, Augustine spotted wire hanging from a building and glistening in the autumn-winter sun. "Gus, what's the deal?" "We head back to the car and find out the information from the forensics. Hopefully that sheds some light on the case. Then I think it's time to speak to Marcus Bright's children." "Is that wise?" "It is if we ask Electra and Alice to do it. I think we need subtlety here. No point in us men going in there. Crash, bang, wallop." "Speak for yourself, Gus."